I have always believed that life, no matter how complicated, is a teacher. Some lessons arrive with gentle hands, and others strike with a force you never expected. My name is Margaret, though most people just call me Maggie. I am 71 years old, and I have lived long enough to see joy, heartbreak, and everything in between. My story is not one of fairy tales. It is a story of family, of betrayal, of forgiveness, and of hope. And though it is painful in places, I tell it with the strength of a woman who has endured, because I know that within every hardship lies a message meant to guide us forward. I was born and raised in a small town in Pennsylvania. My parents were hardworking, modest people who believed in the value of honesty, kindness, and persistence. Those values carried me through marriage, motherhood, and eventually into the season of being a grandmother. When my husband passed away 15 years ago, I thought the hardest part of my life was behind me. But as I've come to understand, the trials of the heart do not disappear with age. My son, David, was always the light of my life. He was gentle as a boy, thoughtful as a teenager, and determined as a man. I raised him with everything I had, especially after his father's passing. And when he grew up and told me he had found the woman he wanted to marry, my heart overflowed with hope. Her name was Emily. From the start, she seemed bright, ambitious, and eager to create a life with David. I welcomed her warmly, as any mother would. I wanted to see them happy together, building a home filled with love. I told myself that if I stepped back, gave them space, and offered my support quietly, they would find their own rhythm without feeling my presence too heavily. But sometimes, what we see at first is only the surface. Beneath the smiles, beneath the politeness, there can be currents we do not recognize until we are pulled under. The early days of their marriage seemed normal enough. They had their little home not too far from mine, and I would visit when invited. Emily was gracious then, at least in the beginning. She would make tea, chat with me about her work, and laugh at David's old childhood stories. I thought, perhaps, I had gained not just a daughter-in-law, but another daughter. Time has a way of revealing truths we don't want to see. It started small comments said lightly but sharp enough to leave a mark. If I suggested a recipe, Emily would smile but say she preferred to do things her way. If I offered advice, even gently, she would nod and then later tell David I was meddling. I brushed it off at first. I told myself she was just adjusting, that she needed space to feel in control of her new household. But soon, the distance grew, invitations became fewer, conversations grew shorter, and I began to notice the subtle looks, the sighs, the tightening of her jaw when I entered the room. I know what some might say, that I am old-fashioned, that I could have stepped back even further, or kept my thoughts entirely to myself. But I was not trying to control, I was trying to be present. A mother's love doesn't vanish when her son becomes a man. It changes, but it doesn't disappear. That I remember one Sunday vividly. David had asked me to come over for dinner. I spent the morning baking a pineapple, his favorite since childhood. When I arrived, Emily's smile was polite but cold. Throughout the meal, I could feel the tension radiating from her. Finally, when I brought out the pie, she sighed loudly and said, "You don't need to keep doing this, Maggie. We're perfectly capable of handling dessert." The words stung more than I expected, not because she dismissed my pie, but because of what lay beneath those words. I was not welcome in the way I had hoped to be. After that day, I began to keep more to myself. I told David I was fine, that I was busy, that he should focus on his wife, but inside, I felt a quiet ache. The home I had dreamed of being part of a family gathering place, warm with laughter, was slipping away. I tried to remind myself of the lessons I'd learned in life, that sometimes silence is the greater wisdom, that not every battle is worth fighting, and that love sometimes asks us to let go. But I also knew, deep down, that this distance was not just growing naturally. It was being built, brick by brick, by the very woman I had trusted with my son's heart. And though I could not yet name it, I was beginning to feel the slow pull of betrayal. As the months went by, the tension between Emily and me grew heavier, though it was rarely spoken aloud. It hung in the air like humidity before a storm, thick and suffocating. invisible to most but impossible for me to ignore. Dafta tried, in his quiet way, to keep peace. He would visit me alone sometimes, bringing groceries or fixing little things around my house. We would sit at the kitchen table, sharing coffee, and for those brief moments, I felt like I still had my son all to myself. But even then, I noticed how he glanced at his watch, how his phone would buzz, and how quickly he would excuse himself to get back home. Emily's presence lingered, even in her absence. One afternoon, I decided to stop by unannounced. It wasn't something I made a habit of, but I had baked a loaf of banana bread and thought David might appreciate it after work. When Emily opened the door, her smile was thin and strained. "Maggie," she said, her voice flat, "you should have called first." I felt my cheeks warm. "I'm sorry, dear. I just thought I'd bring this by. David always loved it." She took the bread, set it on the counter without so much as a thank you, and said, "We're actually just heading out, so it's not a good time." Her words weren't cruel, but the dismissal in them cut deep. I left quickly, my chest tight, tears burning behind my eyes. I told myself not to be so sensitive, that times had changed, that young couples wanted their independence, but still, the ache grew stronger. It wasn't just the bread, or the pie, or the advice. It was the sense that I was being erased from my son's life. Piece by piece, I remembered the vows David had spoken at his wedding, about building a family and cherishing the bonds that held them together. I wondered then if those bonds still included me. The turning point came one summer evening. David had invited me to a barbecue in their backyard. The smell of grilled meat filled the air, and neighbors laughed over drinks. For a while, everything seemed pleasant. I watched the children run across the grass, their giggles reminding me of David's boyhood summers. Then, as I was telling a story about David learning to ride his bike, Emily interrupted. Her voice was sharp, her smile tight. "Maybe we should let David tell his own stories, Meg. People want to hear from him, not from you." The group chuckled awkwardly, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment. I looked at David, hoping he would defend me, but he only smiled weakly and changed the subject. In that moment, I realized something had shifted irreparably. The respect I had once taken for granted was gone, and in its place was a quiet humiliation. That night, lying in bed, I thought of my late husband. He would have told me to be strong, to hold my head high, to remember my worth. I whispered into the dark, "I'm trying, love. I really am." The days that followed were lonelier. Phone calls became rarer. Invitations stopped coming altogether. When I reached out to David, he often said they were busy, that Emily was tired, that maybe next weekend would be better. Next weekend rarely came. I tried to fill my days with gardening, reading, volunteering at the church. Outwardly, I looked like a woman content with her golden years. Inwardly, I felt like I was standing outside a window, watching my family live a life where I no longer belonged. But even in my pain, I held on to one truth. Life is not only about what is taken from us, but about how we respond. I reminded myself that bitterness is a poison we drink, hoping it will harm someone else. I would not let it consume me. Still, I could not deny the wound growing inside me. A wound not of anger, but of betrayal. It was during one particularly quiet week when everything reached a breaking point. David had promised to come by on Saturday to help me fix a leaky faucet. I waited all day, setting out coffee mugs, preparing sandwiches, humming to myself as I looked forward to his company. The hours passed, the clock ticked, and no one came. By evening, I finally called him. His voice was rushed, distracted. "Sorry, Mom, Emily wasn't feeling well, and we decided to stay in. I'll come next weekend." I nodded, though he couldn't see me, my throat tight. "Of course, darling, take care of her." When I hung up, the silence in the house felt unbearable. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to cry openly, the kind of deep, body-shaking sobs that leave you exhausted. That wasn't just the missed visit, it was the realization that I was no longer a priority in my son's life, and perhaps never would be again. Still, even in that grief, a quiet voice inside reminded me Maggie. You are not defined by who includes you or who excludes you. You are defined by the love you choose to keep in your heart. I clung to that thought like a lifeline, because if I let go, I feared I would drown in loneliness. The distance between us widened until it felt like a canyon, impossible to cross. I often wondered if Emily was building those walls intentionally, or if I was simply imagining them. But in my heart, I knew. A mother knows. One afternoon, while I was tidying the living room, I found an old photo album tucked beneath the coffee table. Inside were pictures of David as a boy, his first steps, his school plays, his awkward teenage years, all the way to the day he graduated college. I sat with the album in my lap, tracing the edges of his smiling face with my finger. I remembered the sound of his laughter, the warmth of his hugs, the way he used to say, "I love you, Mom," without hesitation. And I realized how long it had been since I'd heard those words. The grief sat heavy on my chest. I closed the album, whispering a prayer into the quiet room. Lord, don't let my son forget me. It was not long after that when the sharpest blow came. David had always made a point, even if briefly, to see me on my birthday. It wasn't about the gifts or the cake, but simply about being remembered. That year, the day came and went with no call, no visit, not even a message. I sat by the phone, staring at it as if I could will it to ring. Hours passed, night fell, and with each minute, I felt the hollow inside me deepen. The next morning, I finally called him. He answered, his tone distracted. "Mom, I'm so sorry. We were busy yesterday. Emily had a work deadline, and things just slipped my mind." I swallowed hard. "It's all right, darling. I understand." But inside, I did not understand. How could a child forget the woman who had carried him, raised him, loved him through every season of his life? It wasn't just forgetfulness. It was neglect. And it broke something in me. I remember walking to the window that night, staring out at the streetlights glowing against the darkness. I pressed my hand against the glass and whispered, "If this is what family has become, then what is left for me?" Days turned into weeks. The silence between us grew unbearable. Finally, I decided I could no longer sit in the shadows of doubt and pain. I needed answers. I called David one evening and asked if we could meet for coffee. Just the two of us. Reluctantly, he agreed. We met at a small diner, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and the smell of fried food clinging to the air. I watched him walk in, his shoulders tense, his eyes weary. He sat across from me, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I broke the silence. "David, do you still need me in your life?" His eyes widened, and he reached for my hand, but I pulled it back. I needed honesty, not comfort. "Of course I need you, Mom," he said softly. "Why would you even ask that?" Tears welled in my eyes. "Because I feel like I'm losing you, piece by piece, and I don't know how to stop it." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not you. It's just, Emily thinks we need boundaries. She feels like sometimes you don't give us enough space." The words stung like ice against my skin. "Boundaries? I hardly see you as it is. She just wants to build our life together, Mom. She wants to be the center of it, not competing for it." I stared at him, my heart breaking with every word. Competing. That was how Emily saw me. Not as family, not as someone who loved her, but as an opponent. I nodded slowly, my voice trembling. "If that's what she wants, then perhaps the best gift I can give you is to step back, to let you live your life without me in the way." His eyes filled with tears, but he said nothing. And in that silence, I understood. He would not fight for me, not against her. I left the diner that night with a hollow ache I cannot put into words. It was the moment I truly realized that my place in his life had been taken, not by death or distance, but by choice. The weeks that followed were some of the darkest I have known. I moved through my days like a ghost, going through the motions but feeling no joy. Even the garden, once my refuge, seemed lifeless. The flowers bloomed, but I could not see their beauty. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if my life had any meaning left. My son had chosen his wife over me, and though that is natural in many ways, the cruelty of it, the dismissal, The betrayal was unbearable. And yet, deep down, a small voice whispered, "This is not the end of your story." One Sunday morning, I forced myself to go to church. I sat in the pew, feeling fragile and broken, when the pastor spoke words that struck my heart like lightning. He said, "Forgiveness is not about forgetting the wrongs done to you. It is about refusing to let those wrongs define the rest of your life." In that moment, I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. I knew that if I allowed bitterness to take root, it would destroy me from within. I could not change Emily. I could not control David, but I could choose how I would carry myself through the pain. I whispered a prayer. "Lord, help me to forgive, even when it feels impossible. Help me to find hope where there is only hurt." And slowly, like dawn breaking after a long night, I felt a glimmer of strength return. You said. The days after that Sunday sermon were not suddenly easy, but they were different. A seed had been planted in my heart, and though it was small, it gave me something I had been missing. A sense of direction. I realized I had been waiting for David to remember me, waiting for Emily to soften, waiting for the past to return. But life does not move backward. It only moves forward, and we either walk with it or remain stuck in sorrow. So I began to reclaim pieces of myself. I joined a local book club, where women my age gathered not just to talk about stories but to share their own. I volunteered more hours at the church pantry, meeting people who had far less than I did, yet carried themselves with joy. I tended to my garden with new care, not because I hoped someone else would admire it, but because the flowers reminded me that life renews itself, season after season. And slowly, I felt lighter. It was around this time that I received a call from David. His voice was gentler than it had been in months. "Mom," he said quietly, "could we come by? Emily and I want to talk." I hesitated for a moment, my heart leaping and trembling all at once. "Of course, darling, I'll put on a pot of tea." When they arrived, Emily's face was serious, but not as cold as before. She sat across from me, her hands folded in her lap. David looked at me with eyes that carried both guilt and hope. Emily spoke first. "Maggie, I owe you an apology. I know I've pushed you away. I thought I was protecting my marriage, but in the process, I hurt you. And I hurt David, too." Her words surprised me. For so long, I had braced myself against her sharpness. Hearing sincerity in her voice felt almost foreign. I nodded, my own eyes filling with tears. "I never wanted to be in the way. I only wanted to love you both." David reached across the table, taking my hand. "We've been talking, Mom. We want to do better. We want you in our lives, in our future. We don't want to lose you." The ache that had sat in my chest for so long loosened, replaced by something fragile but real. Hope. We spent that afternoon talking, really talking, not about boundaries or mistakes, but about understanding. Emily admitted her insecurities, her fears of not measuring up, her struggles to feel like she belonged in a family where the bond between mother and son was so strong. I listened, not with judgment, but with compassion, because wisdom had taught me this. When people lash out, it often comes from their own pain, not from hatred. By the time they left, the path was not fully mended, but it was begun, and that was enough. The months that followed were not perfect, but they were better. Emily made efforts to include me, inviting me to dinners, asking for my recipes, even sitting beside me during church one Sunday. David called more often, not because Emily reminded him, but because he wanted to. And I, too, learned. I learned to give them space when they needed it, to offer advice only when asked, and to cherish the moments we did share without clinging too tightly. Life will never return to the way it once was when David was a little boy who ran into my arms after school. But life is not meant to remain the same. It changes, it stretches, it challenges us to grow. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, David and Emily arrived unexpectedly. They carried with them a small box, wrapped neatly in paper. "What's this?" I asked with a smile. "Just open it, Mom," David said, his eyes twinkling. Inside was a framed photograph of the three of us together at their home, smiling genuinely. the tension gone. At the bottom, engraved in small letters, were the words, "Family, forever." Tears blurred my vision as I hugged them both. In that moment, I knew that though the road had been painful, though betrayal had cut deep, healing was possible, and it was worth every step. Now, when I look back, I do not see only the hurt. I see the lessons. I see the strength that carried me through. I see the wisdom I can share with others, women who feel forgotten, mothers who feel cast aside, hearts that feel broken beyond repair. To them, and to you, I say this: your story is not over when pain arrives. Your story is not finished when someone betrays your love. As long as you keep your heart open, as long as you choose forgiveness over bitterness, there is always another chapter waiting to be written. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to hope, that chapter can be even more beautiful than the ones before.